So recently, in the United States, something like over 3,000 American cities echoed with the same cry. You've probably seen it on the news. The cry was this: no king. The cry is a protest movement that has emerged in protest and defiance, in disappointment with, in weariness against what we would say is political power going unchecked. People who feel that they are tired of authority acting like it answers to no one, the overreach of government, all summed up in one short slogan: no kings. Now, before I say another word, I am not saying this to make any political statement. Do not read into the fact that I have this up here on the screen right now. Okay? I am not for or against this. I'm not an American, for one thing. Okay? If we want to talk politics, we'll do that later, but that's not why I'm bringing this up. Okay? I'm trying to make you move your focus and attention to something deeper. That the cry "no king" is not new. The Americans didn't just figure this out. This cry begins in every human heart. Every single one of us resists authority. Every single one of us doesn't like to be told what to do. We don't like having our opinions treated as anything other than fact. We don't like the idea of someone else having the final say over our lives. Whether at the dinner table, at the polling station, at our workplace, doesn't matter where it is. We like to decide what's right. We define our own truth, we run our own lives. No kings. But here's the danger with no kings. If everyone is in charge equally, no one is in charge. And what happens then is something called anarchy, which is chaos with a fancy name. And we've seen this in our world. We see what happens when no one's in charge. We see what happens when nobody is leading anything but themselves. We see what happens in ourselves when we follow every impulse, every feeling. When we submit to and justify every single desire and following behavior. We see what happens when we refuse to submit to authorities even in our own lives. It doesn't lead to peace, it leads to fracture, to regret, to things falling apart. And so we live in this contradiction of we don't want kings, but we're not very good at being our own king either, contrary to popular opinion. And deep down we actually know this. And that tension is exactly what the book of Judges explores. You see, the book of Judges is not just an ancient story that many folks in the church have never even actually really read, let alone understood. Judges is a first-hand, so to speak, look at what happens in a no-king culture. When we don't have a king, we don't become free. Our lives become undone, and most of the time we don't even notice at first that it's happening. The cry "no king" is not a rejection of authority as much as it is desperately searching for the right one. So for every time we've said to somebody or God, "Don't tell me how to live my life," we've also felt the weight of not knowing how to live our lives very well. And Judges then is the story of what happens when that tension takes over a people. When there is no king, when lives become undone. So before we get into the meat of this, let me give you some background and some connection to the bigger story here. So last week we looked at Joshua, and if Joshua is the book of victory, this book of claiming God's promise and learning to live in it, Judges is the book of defeat. If Joshua is all about receiving the promise of God, Joshua shows us what happens when it isn't cherished, when the promises of God given to us are squandered. Judges, the name is a little bit misleading because we use the word judge, of course, to talk about law and the judicial system. When we talk about judges in this book, we're talking about deliverers, temporary saviors, who would come along for different generations of Israel and, I don't want to say too much, but either get them out of a problem and often lead them into a far worse one. The theme of this book is failure through compromise. It's failure through coexistence. The author is unknown. We don't know who wrote this book. Most scholars think it probably happened during the reign of King David, somewhere between the 13th and 11th century BC. The book covers about a 400-year period. Two key scriptures. Judges 2, verse 10. We read that after the whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, so this would be the Joshua Promised Land generation, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And then the very last verse of the book of Judges, 21:25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And that's why I'm not making a political statement. We're going to make a biblical statement. Because again, long before protest movements, we had no king going on in the book of Judges. The message of the book is the effect of original sin is that we have a tendency to wander. And when we free ourselves from God, what we do is enslave ourselves to sin, brokenness, contamination, breakdown. The good news is that God is faithful, and in every generation makes a new way for salvation. Now, here's a preface. Judges is a dark book. It is an intentionally dark book. It starts somewhat stable, and very quickly it goes off the rails. And as you read through the book of Judges, you will find that it gets increasingly worse. Morally, spiritually, socially. And by the end of Judges, you're like, man, that is brutal. It's almost shocking. And it's not accidental that the book is this way. It was written this way on purpose to contrast what happens when people squander the promise of God. When people reject God, when people say, I will be my own ruler, we get the book of Judges. And so it's hard to avoid the darkness, and this sermon is going to reflect that to some extent. These aren't my favorite sermons to preach because it's heavy. All 21 chapters. But it is an amazing book in the purpose that it is intended to do, particularly when it is read up against Joshua where it belongs. Because we just looked at the faithfulness of God to give people an incredible promise, and now Judges is going to show us, again, what happens when we don't take that promise seriously. Judges is a prodigal son story against the promises of the Father. All right? The book is going to move, like we did last week, in 3 movements and 3 corresponding lessons. I'm going to give them to you right off the start. Our first movement is the danger of a borrowed faith. God has no grandchildren, will be the lesson. Movement 2 is the spiral of compromise. Sin does not just repeat, it rots. And then finally, movement 3, the chaos of you do you. Anarchy is the ultimate enslavement. We will put this book in a sentence, which is really the sermon in a sentence. When we reject the King, our lives don't become free, they become undone. Okay, you're probably pretty excited. Movement 1, the danger of borrowed faith. God has no grandchildren. Here's Judges 2, 10, and 11 again. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he'd done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they served the Baals. So Joshua's generation dies, and this next generation doesn't know God. They don't know him personally, and they don't even really know what he did. That's really sad, isn't it? They inherited the promised land, but not a relationship with the God who promised it and provided it and was faithful to get his people there. Joshua's generation had seen God move. They had walked through the Jordan on dry ground. They'd seen the walls of Jericho fall. And all through the book, God is faithful to be there and to lead them and to guide them. They weren't just people who had heard about God. They were people that experienced him, that knew him, that encountered him. But this next generation inherits the land, and they somehow didn't inherit the Lord. So there's a lesson here that it is possible that the faith is passed down externally to people, but never internally. Faith does not transfer automatically. God has no grandchildren, only children. The children of God are those who have believed in faith in him and then sought to live out a life of obedience to him. These are the children of God. There's no grandchildren. There's no grandchildren because we cannot live on somebody else's encounter with God. It just doesn't work that way. You can't live on your parents' encounter with God. You can't live on your spouse's encounter with God. You can't live on your church's past glory days. At some point, the question is personal. Do you know this God for yourself? And equally as important, according to Jesus in Matthew 7, is does God know us? Where Jesus says he will ask, or rather declare, depart from me, I didn't know you. This week I was helping my parents rearrange some furniture because I'm a very, very faithful oldest son and glutton for punishment. Yeah, everyone raises their hands, right? And my mom has a collection of china pieces that were like her grandmother's and her mother's and hers. And she's not here. They're in the way. And so I said, Mom, what are we going to do with these? You don't have enough space to just have these out. Well, what am I going to do with them? I can't just throw them away. And so we ping-ponged about the china for some time. And I get it because those pieces are connected to memories that are very meaningful for her. And I can appreciate that. I have no problem with that. History matters. Legacy matters. What is passed down from one generation to another does matter. But in everyday life, those things don't do anything anymore. She doesn't pull them out and eat her toast off them. They just sit there displayed. And I wonder if our faith is something like that. It can be something meaningful. It can be something we value. It can be something that reminds us of our parents or a mentor or whoever it may be, but it's not something we use. It's just sort of displayed. The scary part is that truth isn't even the bottom. It can go worse from there, that Israel didn't just forget God or forget to use God or even have him on display. They entirely replaced him. They got rid of the china for IKEA plates, that type of thing. Judges 2:10 says that they served the Baals. Just this one little sentence, we read over it so quickly, but it's really important. Because Baal is the most active and prominent god in Canaan when Israel moves in. This is the God everybody's worshiping. He's the popular god on the block. And if you remember, God was really clear to Israel that you need to drive everybody out. You can't coexist. You can't intermarry. And he says these things because he tells them it will contaminate you and your faith. And so this tells us that Israel didn't just worship a different God. It tells us they worship what was popular in their culture. What was top dog in their place and time. Now Baal was easy to serve, so to speak, because he seemed to do something for them quickly. Baal didn't seem to them as obviously evil, but rather as something that was convenient, made sense. So it was believed that Baal offered two notable benefits. First, that he was the god of rain. And so if you cared about crops, and of course at this time in human history you most certainly did, because it's how you ate and it's how you traded, that really mattered. And so they went, oh good, this guy will guarantee to give us big, bountiful crops. The second thing Baal did was he promised fertility. And so of course, growing your tribal line, many hands to get the job done, a large inheritance of children was incredibly valued, very different than our culture today. And so a God that is going to make your family grow and make your crops grow, and he's going to do it pretty quickly, yeah, I'm in. Where do I sign up? Baal was believed to offer to Israel something immediate and practical. Something that felt like it would work. And church, that's what makes idolatry so dangerous. It is not necessarily a rejection of a theological system. It's not necessarily the rejection of a belief. It is the replacement of trust. It's what are we counting on? This chapter in Israel's story, this chapter that is Judges, shows us that when faith is borrowed, just part of our story, rather than owned for ourselves, it is easy to trust thousands of other things. Day to day, week to week, year to year. And so some of us here today are first generation Christians. Amazing. Judges is a cautionary tale on what one generation had so beautifully was not very well handed over to the next. And some of us have a long spiritual legacy. Great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents that were followers of Jesus. That's a gift. But it raises a question, how did this get passed on? How do we pass something on to the next generation that is not just remembered nostalgically, but actually gets lived out? Because we don't want our children to just know about God. We want to know him, and we want the next generation to know him like we did. We don't want to pass on stories and myths, folk tales. We want to pass on a faith that can survive real pressure. When the generation before us is gone and we don't have anybody to fall and say, pray for me. And we have to pray for ourselves. Judges does not joke around about this. It shows us that when a generation doesn't know God, they don't stay neutral. They drift and they substitute and they will turn to something else repeatedly. And I say this a lot, but I say it on purpose. Before we assume that this isn't talking about us, that it must be talking about somebody else, that guy at work, we need to recognize how this works in our own life. Because we don't necessarily worship Baal. In fact, some of you, if not most of you, don't even know what Baal looks like. But we all have substitutes. Substitutes of our place and our time and our city and our culture that we dabble with. People we listen to that we shouldn't. Paths of peace that we embrace that we shouldn't. Methods to ensure security that are lies. Products and experiences to bring us joy and distract us from real life. Those aren't horned gods with the thunder stick standing above the mountain, but they are every bit as dangerous. These are gods of compromise. And so the book of Judges invites us to wrestle with the question, are you trying to live your own life, your life of faith, on somebody else's relationship with God? And I think Judges, in sort of a brutal way, would say, make sure you're not. Make sure you're not. Because if you are, the spiral is about to begin. Because if faith is only inherited and it is never owned, it doesn't stay neutral. It will erode, and the erosion then is where the spiral of compromise begins, which is the next movement. Spiral of compromise that Israel experiences, where we see that sin doesn't just repeat, it rots. 2:18 through 19. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, remember, deliverer, savior, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived for. The Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways, this is the important part, underline it, even more corrupt than their ancestors, following other gods. Let's just bring a few more into this cocktail. Serving and worshiping them, they refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. I won't ask by a show of hands, because I believe that you all read the book of Judges this week. So assuming you all did, then you probably noticed that Judges feels like a cycle. It's rebellion, retribution, repentance, rescue, repeat. Generation after generation. And it seems cyclical at first. You look at it and you're going, yeah, I see the pattern here. But the truth is, Judges, though it has cyclical elements, the community is spiraling, not just circling. Because every time that the people return to sin, they don't return to the same place. They go lower. It gets darker. Verse 19, to ways even more corrupt than their ancestors. That one line tells us something very important, that Israel didn't stabilize their failures. They didn't learn how to manage sin. They didn't go, we can handle just that much of it. They deepened it, generation after generation. And you can see, even in the judges, the national leaders, these saviors, these deliverers themselves, they get contaminated. And the leaders in these stories actually serve as sort of a mirror for what's going on in the people. Which is an amazing thing if you start to think about how our ultimate Redeemer, by the way, Jesus, how what he does is mirrored in us. But that's for another time. And so you've got this lady named Deborah, for example. She's early on in the book. She's actually not too bad. She's known for like her wisdom and her clarity, and she's really courageous. Then you got a guy named Gideon. He's kind of the popular one in this book. And he's okay. I mean, he's kind of a coward at first. But then he does some good things, and then he basically reintroduces idolatry to Israel. So he fails at the end. You got this guy named Jephthah, who's empowered by God. But he makes this reckless vow that if God will give him victory, he will sacrifice the first thing he sees. And that first thing he sees ends up being his daughter. And his heart breaks. Samson, extraordinary strength, but he's completely unanchored in character, and he's brought to his knees, to his state of utter blindness by his girlfriend. All the men say, amen. I'm joking. I'm joking. Even the deliverers deteriorate. And the spiral deepens. And that's what sin does when it's left unchecked. It doesn't just stabilize, it rots. It pollutes. It contaminates. Theologian with maybe the coolest name of all time, because he sounds like a Babar character, if you remember that show. His name's Cornelius Plantinga Jr. Says this: sin is remarkably generative. Sin yields more and more sin. In a standard scenario, Each episode of sin gets triggered by trouble from the last. Sin is a plague that spreads by contagion or even by quasi-genetic reproduction. Easy, Cornelius. We don't do science in the Trinity. It's a polluted river that keeps branching and rebranching into tributaries. It's a whole family of fertile and contentious parents, children, and grandchildren. The point is, sin never stays contained. What begins as a small compromise becomes a habit. The New Testament tells us this. What becomes a habit will become an identity. Hi, I'm Zach, and I'm an alcoholic. But exactly, what was once a habit became an identity. What once felt like conviction slowly goes silent. And so here's another warning in this book, that Israel's downfall didn't begin with rebellion. It began with coexistence. It began with partial obedience. It began with compromise. This is what I said at the beginning. You need to drive out all the nations. You need to get these people out. You can't intermarry with them. And they didn't. Israel assumed that sin and compromise could just be managed. It's just a little bit of sin. Only sin on Saturday. But compromise will lie to you about its limits all the time. It tells you that it'll stay contained, but it doesn't. Judges is this ugly lesson that what we tolerate today ends up shaping us tomorrow. We see this nationally, church. And I don't just mean in Canada, globally. When a nation, tolerates today becomes the next generation's culture that they didn't even know how they got there. The small compromises don't stay small, they move in. They take the center. And before you realize it, your desires have been retrained. And then you begin to wonder, how did it ever get so out of hand? How did I get like this? Because it's a spiral, and it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't warn you. It just deepens. Until one day you look up and you realize that something has come undone. And if that compromise is left unchecked long enough, it won't just corrupt individuals, it will reshape entire cultures. Until you do you becomes the only rule left. The chaos of you do you. Anarchy is the ultimate enslavement. As I said, the book of Judges ends like this. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Not sure if you've ever heard this expression before. I hadn't, until I was working on this sermon. The expression is this: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Anybody ever heard this before? Good. You don't feel as dumb. So where this expression comes from is studies that have been done on intergenerational wealth. And it shows that family fortunes are rarely sustained beyond 3 generations. So one analysis, specifically from the Williams Group, found that 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the 2nd generation, and nearly 90% by the 3rd. Now, obviously, the money isn't just disappearing overnight. The money didn't get up and walk away. And so these studies have found that there are these certain patterns. One, communication fractures. The one generation doesn't communicate well with the generation who went before them. Governance disappears. You do you. Well, that was your way. I do it like this. The next generation was unprepared to stick to those foundational values and practices that the generation before used to create the wealth. Now, without structure, what was built very slowly collapses very quickly. In other words, what is built under order will rarely survive in a culture of disorder, of you do you. Judges 21 shows the same pattern, but it's showing it on a national scale. We talked about this. The people inherit the land, but they lose the capacity to live well in it. This final chapter of Judges, if you just want to read one chapter, read this one. It is not subtle. It's devastating. Civil war, broken vows, kidnapped women, genocide. You do you does not sound like liberty at all in Judges 21. It sounds like complete moral and spiritual national collapse. Judges is the story of what happens when a dumb, catchy slogan becomes a system. And all of this traces back to everything that we looked at to get started. In those days, Israel had no king. Not just political leadership, but a nation full of people devoted and led by the one true holy God. Because people have proven, not just in Judges, but through human history, when there is no king above us, we will become kings over ourselves. But the result is never freedom, it is always fracture. And this is something that we hate to say, let alone believe, but when everyone becomes their own authority, nobody's safe. I don't know about everybody here, but my generation, we were told to read Lord of the Flies in junior high school. Lord of the Flies is just a parable of Judges, really. It's just what happens when there's no king. Some of us have probably seen this happen in our lives already, maybe more than once. I have. Some of us might be sensing even this day, oh, yikes, I'm not too far away. Some of us are praying for somebody that we love, who seems to be living out the book of Judges right now. So what do we do? And I'm honored that you think I have a good answer. You know how much generational wealth I would have for my children to squander if I had the perfect answer to that? We have to look to the only answer that's ever been given, to a world that is bent on living with no kings. So before we look at Jesus in the book of Judges, here's the sermon in a sentence, or the book in a sentence one more time. When we reject the right king, our lives don't become free, they become undone. I've used this illustration before because it always makes me laugh when I'm around people who have this experience. I don't tend to have this experience, but I know many of you probably do. So have you ever watched a movie that just ends with no resolution? There's no closure. You're just left sitting there, like frustrated, confused, wanting the story to come back together, the couple to find love, the bad guy to get what he deserves. And then it's just nothing. You're just left hanging there to make your own sense of whatever it was that you just saw. Judges feels like that. It doesn't resolve, it just stops. Everything's a mess and it just says there's no king, they just did you. Period. And so naturally the reader should ask, well, what kind of king can fix this? It seems like that was part of the problem. So what kind of king can fix this? What kind of leader can hold a people together? Of course, the answer doesn't come in Judges. It comes in Jesus, who amazingly is very subtly introduced in the very next book, the book of Ruth. where Jesus' line begins. Oh, the Old Testament. I don't think it has much to say today. Judges shows us life when Jesus, the King of Kings, is rejected and replaced. But Jesus, of course, is not just another judge in this cycle. He is the judge who ends the cycle. Where every other leader fails, Jesus is faithful. Where every other deliverer is temporary, Jesus is final. His kingdom will know no end. Ah, Merry Christmas. Yes, and it's so much bigger than that. Jesus delivers us from both the why we do it and the what it is that we're doing. And he doesn't just step into the story. Jesus becomes the whole story. And I've talked to you about this before. But Jesus is not just an example. Jesus, in fact, became the perfect Israel, where he does the perfect obedience. But at the same time, he's also the perfect judge who saves and deals with the problem. All caught up in this one deliverer. And so Jesus steps into our place, into the imperfection of a people that can never, ever, ever do this right. And at the cross, he takes the full weight of a world that never wanted a king, and he bears that punishment. All of the ugliness of judges is put on him. Their children are sacrificed, and women are raped, and violence knows no limits. Jesus somehow carries this upon himself. And he says, I will die for it, and when I die for it, I will rise up as the King of all kings and the Lord of all lords. And so the question that Judges presents is solved then not just in the next chapter, but in the entire grand story of the God who became king for a people who never deserved one, and were given one by grace and by mercy alone. And so Judges leaves us then not with an answer, but a question. Who will be your king? So like people want to know how do they introduce people to the gospel. So go read the book of Judges. That's your life. But there's an answer. Let me tell you about it. Judges tells us the problem. Every one of us is being ruled by something, some things. The usual suspects, we talk about them a lot: control, comfort, success, yourself, your family, your money, your politics, your pop culture, your career. But as we've seen, when people reject the true king, we don't live better. We don't become more free. We become undone. And people don't always notice it right away. We talked about it. It could be that you're right in the middle of it. Could be feeling the weight of this whole thing right now. My prayer for all of us, really regardless of where we are in this story, is that we would hear the beauty in the ashes that is the book of Judges. That we were never meant to carry the weight of ruling our own lives. Anybody tired of ruling your own life? What a horrible experience. And I'm so glad for that good news, because much to the deceit of pride, which will make you believe you're something you're not, we are not very good at ruling our own lives. We are not as ordered and managed and smart as we think we are. We're broken, frail, fickle, inconsistent. And that's why Jesus came, to forgive our sin, but also, shockingly, to be our king. Not just to rescue you, church, but to lead you. Judges isn't just a story to understand then, talk about it as if it's a biblical study, but this is a question, a decision to make. Will you keep trying to rule your own life, or will you surrender to the one in whom the Apostle Paul said to the Colossian church, all things are held together?